So, the following program is brought to you by Haymarket Books. And at a time like this, radical ideas are obviously needed more than ever. And Haymarket, as well as producing these virtual events, brings out books by Arundhati Roy, Keeanga Yamada Taylor, Angela Davis, Naomi Klein, and many other wonderful writers. And if you're moved by any of the program that you're about to see, you can support the work of Haymarket by buying their books from their own website. And even better, you can join the Haymarket Book Club.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us for today's forum on Syria and the second wave of revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa. My name is Danny Postel. I'm in Chicago, and I'm honored to be moderating the discussion today. Before I introduce our participants, I want to thank the organizers of this event, the Global Campaign of Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution, Haymarket Books, and Pluto Press. Now more than ever, it's critical that we support independent publishers like Haymarket and Pluto and independent bookstores. And you can do this in three ways. First, by buying books from Haymarket and Pluto directly via their websites. Second, by joining the Haymarket Books Book Club. And third, if you're in a position to make a donation, no matter how small, via Venmo, there will be a card on screen about how to do this, and folks posting that information in the YouTube chat as well. This video will be recorded and shared afterwards on the Haymarket Books YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video now, and share it with as many people as possible. I also want to quickly let everyone know about some upcoming events in Haymarket's live stream series. Next Wednesday, July 29th, Racism is a Public Health Crisis. And on Thursday, July 30th, The Tragedy of American Science with Cliff Connor and Sarah Lazar. You can register for these upcoming events on Eventbrite. Okay, a few housekeeping items. We are moderating the chat, but we can't guarantee that everyone will observe our community guidelines. People who violate those guidelines will have their comments deleted as quickly as we're able. For folks who want to follow the chat, we suggest you use the top chat option rather than live chat. With so many people joining this call, we may need your patience if we have any technical issues. If your stream gets choppy, it might help to reduce your image quality. Haymarket will give instructions on how to do so in the chat. If our YouTube feed is interrupted for any reason, you may need to navigate back to the Haymarket Books YouTube channel. The feed should resume there in case of interruption. This event will have live closed captions. Instructions for accessing the captions will be posted in the chat. With this in mind, all of us will also try to speak more slowly. And I want to thank Maggie Rumfelt for live captioning this event. We will have time toward the end of our discussion for Q&A. So please get your questions ready and post them in the YouTube chat window, and we'll get to those in due course. And finally, let me mention that today's panel is part of a series of webinars happening this summer on the theme of the Syrian Revolution, a history from below. The videos can all be found at SyrianRevolt.org. There are 2 more webinars in the series after today's. This coming Wednesday, July 29th, Jailed Revolutionaries, Resistance to Assad's Carceral State. And finally, on Wednesday, August 5th, Where Next for the Syrian Struggle. You can find the details about these webinars, plus videos of all the past ones. There have been 8 so far, And you can find those all at SyrianRevolt.org and on the Facebook page of the Global Campaign of Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my interlocutors for today's discussion. Sara Abbas is a Sudanese PhD candidate in political science at the Freie Universität Berlin. Her doctoral research focuses on the discourses and practices of women members of Sudan's Islamist movement and the former ruling party of deposed dictator Omar al-Bashir. Most recently, she has been researching the resistance committees that emerged out of Sudan's 2018 revolution. She is a member of Sudan Uprising Germany and the Alliance of Middle Eastern and North African Socialists. Gilbert Achcar is Professor of Development Studies and International Relations at SOAS, University of London. His many books include Morbid Symptoms, Relapse in the Arab Uprising, The People Want, a Radical Exploration of the Arab Uprising, Marxism, Orientalism, Cosmopolitanism, The Arabs and the Holocaust, the Arab-Israeli War of Narratives, Perilous Power, the Middle East and U.S. Foreign Policy with Noam Chomsky, and The Clash of Barbarisms, the Making of the New World Disorder. Joseph Daher is a Swiss-Syrian activist and academic. He's the author of Syria After the Uprisings, The Political Economy of State Resilience, and Hezbollah, The Political Economy of Lebanon's Party of God. He is a member of the Alliance of Middle Eastern and North African Socialists and the founder of the blog Syria Freedom Forever. He teaches at the University of Lausanne and is part of the Wartime and Post-Conflict in Syria project at the European University Institute in Florence. So welcome to all three of you. It's very exciting to be in dialogue with you today. Let me start with something, Gilbert, that you wrote recently in an essay. You described what you called the second revolutionary shockwave that started in December 2018 with the Sudanese uprising, followed since February 2019 by the Algerian uprising, and since last October by massive social and political protests in Iraq and in Lebanon. Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon, you write, have been boiling since then, while all other countries of the region are on the brink of explosion. All other countries of the region are on the brink of explosion. This picture that you paint, Gilbert, flies directly in the face of the narrative so pervasive in Western capitals amongst so-called realists, policymakers, pundits, and the media class, and even in certain quarters of the left. The narrative that the Arab Spring was a complete failure, or at best an illusion, a fever dream from which the world soon awoke. Order has been restored, the dictators and monarchs are back in charge, and the world can keep on doing business with them. Talk about how that narrative emerged and why it's wrong in your view.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Danny. Hello to everybody. And I also thank the organizers. And I thank you, Danny, for moderating this session. Well, with regard to the issue that you just raised, I think it's pretty clear to any observer of the region that since what was called the Arab Spring in 2011, this region has been very profoundly destabilized. And it has been since then in a state of tension, including, of course, as we know, three countries in the midst of war, of conflict, armed conflict, which are Syria, our main topic, or the main topic of the series of discussions, of webinars, Yemen, of course, and Libya. But all other countries have seen a lot of social protests, some of them, economic difficulties, social economic difficulties, putting a strain on the kind of situation you have, and the repressive measures of governments to try, I mean, in some of the cases, to try to prevent social explosion. So all this is related to the key issue, which is why did you have what was called the Arab Spring? You know, was it just some kind of seasonal explosion with no future? And there you have, of course, many people who may have portrayed it as such, or as a failure, as you said. The question is, I mean, or the issue, the key point is that the failure of a revolution or a first phase in a revolutionary process doesn't mean that the issues that led to this explosion, the social explosion, have been solved. Far from it, actually. Often that means that not only these issues are still there, but they are worsening. They are worse than what they were before, if only because of the conditions created by the social explosion itself. And so that's the point. The point is to understand why you had this major shockwave, revolutionary shockwave that engulfed the whole region. Practically all Arabic-speaking countries have seen in 2011 a sharp rise in social movement, social protest, and 6 of them at that time have seen major uprisings. If you think of that, 6 countries in 2011 and 4 countries in 2019 going through major uprisings, that's already a total of 10 countries, which is not far from the half the number of countries of the region. I mean, Arabic-speaking countries. And if you take by population, it's even more than half, because of Egypt being one of them. So that shows you the magnitude of what we are going through. And this magnitude points, therefore, to very deep problems, the very deep roots. And these deep roots are essentially social and economic before being political. They are also political, definitely. And there are many forms of also social oppression that I won't mention, because practically you name it, you get it in the region. All forms of social oppression, or all forms of gender oppression, and the rest are very much present. But the deep root of the explosion itself has been the accumulation of a social economic problem over a few decades, and that was manifested by the very slow rate of economic growth, hardly matching the demographic changes in the region, and translating into major social problems, the most obvious of which was, and still is, and more than ever, youth unemployment. We are speaking of a part of the world with the highest rates of youth unemployment in the whole world. I mean, as a region, this is the region, Middle East and North Africa, is the region where you had the highest rates of youth unemployment, and that for many, many years now. So all this points to the real problems that have been exploding, and that's why, I mean, what started in 2011 can only be characterized as a process, as a long-term revolutionary process. That's the only accurate description of what it is. And as all long-term revolutionary processes in history, of course, they go through different phases, and you have successive revolutionary waves or successive revolutionary attempts. Of course, it's not easy to especially with the kind of regimes that you have to achieve any victories. Until then, you have 2 countries that have achieved some kind of victories that are still preserved. That is, in the 2 countries, the process is in different forms ongoing, which are Tunisia and Sudan. But as a whole, the whole region is permanently now on the brink of new explosions. And I would end this my answer by pointing also to the effect now of the major economic crisis that the world is going through with the COVID-19 and its impact on the region, which will be even more devastating than in other parts of the world.
Yeah, as you've pointed out, the pandemic has meant the end of some of the mass protests that we saw, for example, in Algeria, but it has only exacerbated the conditions that gave rise to those protests to begin with. So let me turn to Sara, because as Gilbert notes, this second revolutionary shockwave of Arab uprisings started in December 2018 in Sudan. And so before we get into the tricky issue of where the Sudanese popular struggle goes from here at this juncture, I'd like to back up a little bit, Sara, and ask you, what has Sudan's December revolution, as the uprising is known, what has it achieved already? You, in a recent article, described it as a mass, non-violent uprising that began in December 2018, and despite massive brutality by the state, managed in April of 2019, just a few months later, to bring down the 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. And you say that this revolution, the Sudanese December revolution, was both political and social. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that, Sara?
Yeah, no problem. Thanks a lot for having me. In Sudan, I think it's important to make the distinction early, in the sense that when we're speaking about where the struggle is at, we look both at the first wave of uprisings in 2010, 2011, 2012, within the with the so-called Arab Spring. But we also look at our own history very much. It's a reference point for us because, of course, the December 2018 revolution in Sudan was this third mass uprising in our post-colonial history. So the first was in 1964, the second was in 1985. And in each of those cases, we have a dynamic whereby multi-party elected coalitions are overthrown by military coups, which are then, after a period of time, then deposed by popular uprisings that are very much organized by and led by labor unions and by a lot of mass mobilization on the ground. So this was always very important for us, because when we were very much, particularly Egypt, has a very, our histories are very intertwined. You know, it's our neighbor. It's also the sort of hegemonically the big country in the region. There's also a colonial history there. It wasn't just British colonialism, but somehow Egypt was in that mix. And of course, we watched incredibly closely what was happening in Egypt during their uprising in 2011. But, you know, when SCAF took over, that was something we have experienced. We understand this kind of history and tend to know generally how it ends when the military is in politics, right? But just to kind of go back to your question about the social and the economic aspect of it, one part of it is exactly what Gilbert was talking about. I think sometimes, particularly in Western media, in the attempt to talk about the sort of political aspects of this, the authoritarianism, the lack of freedoms that people have revolted on, there is a kind of tendency to downplay the economic struggles, which I think also in Sudan are very much at the heart of many of these things. I mean, as myself as an academic, we make these distinctions, but these are very much intersecting things. So to give an example from Sudan, definitely youth unemployment is a massive problem because, and particularly, you know, we're a country where 61% of the population is under the age of 25. I mean, imagine that, 61% of the population is younger than 25 years old. So this is a massive issue, but there are other issues which have to do with the systematic dispossession. This is a kind of colonial dynamic that was very much continued and extended by post-colonial regimes, whether military or civilian, the very short periods of civilian government, where there's a lot of resource extraction from areas of the country that are propping up an elite at the center, an Arab-identified elite at the center of the country, and that creates classes of citizenship. And these have very particular, strong racial constructions, but also economic implications, right? So if you come from Darfur, a lot of our post-colonial economies relied on these cash crops that the British had cultivated, where whether it's sesame seeds or gum arabic from Western Sudan, whether it's cotton from the agricultural areas. And so a lot was being taken and extracted out of these regions and nothing given back to them. So there is also that dynamic, and that has continued and been extended also through the different wars. But I also say it's a social revolution. In my case, I'm very interested in gender and in women's movements historically in Sudan, or women's activism, let's put it, because the question of movement is more complicated. And we saw definitely some aspects of these protests that were familiar. For example, the role of labor unions and professional associations, and others that were very different. So while women have always been part of these previous uprisings, the extent to which they were there, the type of practices, for example, during the sittings of being at night, sleeping over at the site of the sittings, many of these were new to us. And so there's also been social changes that have been incredibly important. And I mean, I could really go on and give many examples of this. So I think it's what's very important is to think about, definitely, I would say, in terms of gains, and we can talk about this later, there have been some political and legal reform that has definitely happened since last year. I think the economic issues have been harder to shift, and the will and desire to shift them has been more limited, at least on the part of those in power. So this is something that's very important to talk about, because I was also in Tunisia in the years following 2011, and what our measure is of success, I mean, already Gilbert has pointed to this. It's very important to look at actually where these economic struggles are, also as a measure of success.
Thanks for that, Sara. And just to follow up on where things are today in Sudan, it's been a year, almost exactly a year now, since the August 2019 constitutional declaration, right? The negotiated deal that ushered in a transitional period of power sharing between the civilian opposition and the military. This was a hotly debated deal amongst Sudanese revolutionaries. It's been a year now, and where do things stand as we approach the 1-year anniversary? I was struck by something that you wrote in your latest article, where you talked about an open sit-in in the town of Nertiti in central Darfur, an area, as you point out, an area that has long been targeted by state violence, racism, neglect, dispossession, and war. You note that this sit-in in the town of Nertiti in Darfur really raises some of the core, kind of symbolizes some of the core demands and challenges that afflict this negotiated transition, this constitutional declaration 1 year on. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, we're at a period of another massive wave of sittings that have popped up. Of course, the sitting was a protest tactic that was part of the Sudanese revolution. There was several sittings in 13 cities last year between April and June. And they were very important moments in the revolution, or on the revolutionary path. There have been, I think it challenges, first of all, the narrative of, this is when the revolution starts, this is when it ends. Then we move into this neat period of transition where we work towards having a constitution and elections, right? There is these roadmaps. it challenges them because, as we know, even in the cases where there are limited gains, I would say, from this, there are gains for sure from this mass uprising in Sudan. They are limited to the extent that, of course, the power structure is only partially shifted. I mean, we are still in a power sharing deal with the military and also the militias. I think we often put in Sudan's case, the militias are also an actor that's the militia of the Rapid Support Forces. It's an actor that is linked to the military, but also independent in other ways, an independent variable in other ways. But I think what's important is this wave of sittings, there's at least 2 or 3 things that are very notable about it. Where these sittings are taking place, they are taking place in what you would say in Arabic, manatiq al-hamish. There's a language we use in Sudan where we talk about the peripheral regions. Of course, the point of reference being Khartoum, or the center around the sort of confluence of the Nile. And so there's a language about the peripheries, but also these are regions for the most part like that have had just the most brutal experience of both war and of capitalism, of dispossession, of extraction. And so Sudanese feminist Hikma Ahmed Yaqub, she put it this way. She said, we are witnessing, if that was the revolution of the stable cities, this is the revolution of the burned cities. These are people for whom security, just their physical security, and it's something that a lot of Syrians, I think, can relate to in Syria, that before we can talk about many other things, they have to be safe. I mean, they have not been safe, at least in a region like Darfur, since 2003, when the genocide was at its height. And so they are asking because they are unable. These sitting in inertity in this town, which has sort of inspired other sittings. They are asking, I mean, if you just look at the list of demands, it kind of answers this question of sort of the economic and the political and the social. They're asking, for example, for the militias to be disarmed. They're asking for their marginalization to end. They are asking for safety to be able to farm and to be able to herd. The regions around it are rural. They are asking for the mining operations in the area to be brought under the control of the government. And so they are asking for safety, but they're also asking for an end to the continuation of their second-class citizenship, right? And so they are not putting it in, these are political demands and these are social demands. But it highlights this issue of, yes, we've made a lot of gains, but vast areas of the country continue to not see changes. And they are rising up against that, and this is incredibly important. Has there been progress? Have there been things? Of course. And as Muslim and Neil, an activist within the revolution, a young activist, has put it, there have been gains despite the deal with the military, despite this controversial deal. One of them being that, we've dismantled the public order laws, which were a way of the regime control people. There are serious attempts to try to dismantle the apparatus of the regime in terms of its definitely political networks. It had a policy called empowerment, of sort of controlling state and private institutions, but also its economic networks, which are much more difficult to dislodge than the political networks. So there have been changes, but it continues. I mean, I don't think it's not this kind of smooth path that you see. There's a lot of contestation still, and there's continued protest on the ground, of course, in the context of COVID, which makes it very complicated.
Gilbert, as someone who has written recently about Sudan yourself, do you want to add anything to Sara's observations?
No, I mean, I agree with Sara's depiction of what's going on, but the key point is that we have to keep in mind that this is, with all the limitations that Sara pointed to, it is the most advanced process that we have seen in the region until now, because of the forms of organization, because of the power of mobilization of the mass movement, because of the forms of organization of the youth. The Sudanese youth is remarkably active in this whole process. This is a process that is still going on. That is, I mentioned that you have two countries where achievements are still there, which are Tunisia and Sudan. These are the two countries where, if you ask people, was it better before the uprising? People will say definitely not. Whereas for all other countries, take Egypt for today, everybody says Mubarak was great. I mean, compared to what they have today. So the two countries where people are still believing that they achieved something are Tunisia and Sudan, but with a major difference, which is Tunisia has stopped. The process is blocked at the level of political reforms and achieving democracy, freedom, and things like that, which are real achievements, no doubt about that. But that's all. I mean, the whole process is blocked. The key working class force in the country, which is the major union, the central union federation in the country, has been very much engaged into a kind of what you could call a collaborationist position in some way ending the social process and allowing for the kind of quite rotten political compromise that you have. I mean, they achieve democracy, but the kind of democracy they have is not exactly very inspiring. I would say it resembles those rotten democracies that we have in a country like Lebanon, for instance, or other places. So in Sudan, the issue is different because the process is still there, even in its deep social economic character. That is, the pressure is still there, and an organized pressure. And of course, the compromise that was achieved between the military and let's say the popular movement, put it that way, is something that can't last. That is, it's a kind of transitional period. You have de facto two countervailing powers in Sudan. One are the military, and the other is the popular movement in some way, which was exerting pressure. And caught between the two, you have this government with the Prime Minister Hamdouk at the head. And this can't last forever. I mean, eventually, one of the two will have to get rid of the other, and that's the key point. But crucially, the mass movement is organized. The youth is organized. The unions, the kind of professional association framework is still there. There are attempts by the military, by the security forces to dismantle all that by various tricks, but the impetus is still here. And we have seen recently, Sara pointed to the periphery, but even centrally, there have been also big mobilizations very recently, and the pressure is there, the demand of the people, the movement, that to go forward, to go beyond, and even to implement part of the things that were agreed with the military, which have not yet been implemented.
Well, this leads to my next question, which is this second wave of uprisings across the region. You've suggested, Gilbert, and Sara kind of pointed to this in an earlier comment, that there is a sense in which this second wave is not just a repeat or an extension of the first wave of uprisings beginning in December 2010 and into 2011, but rather that it has the advantage several years later that it can learn and has learned, right, from the errors, not only the achievements, but the errors that many of those, the first wave of uprisings encountered. So, for example, you say, Gilbert, you write that in Egypt, there were huge illusions about the military among the population of Egypt, culminating in the 2013 coup that brought General Sisi, or Field Marshal Sisi, to power. But you write, these illusions were not reiterated in Sudan or Algeria in 2019. On the contrary, the popular movements in these two countries have been acutely aware that the military constitute the central pillar of the regime that they wish to get rid of. It was clear, you write elsewhere, it was clear that the changes at the highest levels of the Egyptian state after 2011 had not altered the foundations of the regime, so that the dictatorship returned with a vengeance 3 years later. This made the popular movements in Algeria and Sudan wary. They continued to protest vigorously after their presidents were ousted, demanding a civilian government with full executive powers. So my question for both you and Sara and Joe is, was this actually a case of revolutionary learning, or what some scholars call social movement learning, in which Sudanese and Algerian activists saw what happened in Egypt and consciously steered clear of the pitfalls in those two cases? Or rather, was this to do more with the peculiarity of Egypt, the much discussed reverence in Egypt for the institution of the military that goes deep in the Egyptian popular imagination, culture, even consciousness? How would you respond to that, Gilbert?
Well, there is definitely a learning curve in social movements, in revolutionary processes. It is a learning curve, and people can see. Of course, there are different political conditions. One major political condition, which is anyhow also a qualitative difference between the first wave of 2011 and the second wave of 2019, is that in the first wave, almost in all theaters, the Muslim Brotherhood, or any equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood, were very much involved in trying to hijack the uprisings and revolutionary processes. And they played a key role also in fostering those illusions about the military in Egypt, in the first period. And in the second period, it was unfortunately some forces, described as left-wing or progressive, and the liberals who fostered the illusions about the military in ousting the Muslim Brotherhood. So the result of all that, being a much uglier dictatorship today in Egypt than what you had before 2011, is there to be seen by everybody, and it has been seen. And so if you compare the reaction in 2011, 11th February 2011, and there's the illusions about the army as being the savior that you had in Cairo, and that were pushed by some political forces, as I said, those were not repeated in either Algiers, where the president was removed basically by the military. It was a resignation, but everybody understood. And then in Khartoum, in Sudan, in both in Algeria and in Sudan, people didn't get these great illusions about the great saviors of the army, and they kept pushing, and they kept regarding the military as the obstacle, as the regime, the backbone of the regime that we are struggling against. These guys are this backbone, and this is what we want to get rid of. And so yes, in that from that angle, yes, this is a very, very important lesson drawn by this, and this is also related to the fact that the three countries have this in common, that they are the only three countries among the Arabic-speaking countries where the military, the army, is the main political institution. It is there is a real autonomy of the institution, which does not belong to any ruling family, like is the case in the monarchies or in Syria, for instance. And that's why you could see in the three countries the army toppling the president. Yes, because the army believed that, to preserve its own privileges and its own rule, it had to do so. But it worked in Egypt twice, in 2011 and 2013, with the consequences that we just described. It didn't work in Algeria or Sudan. It didn't work at all, and in both countries, in Sudan and Algeria, it has been frozen due to COVID-19. But there is absolutely no doubt of the fact that it is simmering, and the movement will resume anytime it can when the preventions for medical reasons or whatever will diminish.
I'd like to shift slightly to the question of leadership, because actually all three of you in different ways have written about the question of leadership. I just want to again quote something that Gilbert wrote and then ask Sara and Joe what they think. Gilbert wrote that the popular movement in Algeria is remarkable for having staged huge mass demonstrations every week for over a year. Its stamina is truly exceptional, but has no recognized or legitimate leadership. Nobody can claim to speak in its name, and this is an obvious weakness. In stark contrast with Sudan, forms of leadership naturally change over time, but we haven't entered some postmodern age, Gilbert writes, of leaderless revolutions, as some want to believe. The lack of leadership is a real and far-reaching impediment. A recognized leadership is crucial in order to channel the strength of the mass movement towards a political goal. This exists in Sudan with all its contradictions, but not in Algeria, not in Iraq, not in Lebanon. So, Joe, to bring you into the dialogue, and we will do more of that soon when we shift to Syria, I would like to hear from both you and Sara on this question of leadership.
Thank you, Danny. First of all, I would like to thank you for moderating, all the organizers, and it's a pleasure to speaking alongside Gilbert and Sara. No, definitely I agree, and I written something going into the same direction, that the lack of leadership. And obviously when we speak about the leadership, it shouldn't be into an elitist way. What we mean, it's about the possibility of mass organizing from below and giving a particular political orientation with, obviously, when you have a strong feminist movement or women activist movement and a strong trade union movement, it gives you a particular stamina to go forward in particular demands that are as well democratic and socio-economic, which I think is very important on many aspects. And definitely also what we spoke from before is that why Sudan and Tunis are, if you want, in a better or less worse situation than the rest of the countries of the Middle East and North Africa that have witnessed uprisings on a large scale, is this: they had from below mass organizations that could organize, whether trade unions or feminists in both cases. So I think it's a key issue today. And actually, if you see that it's a question that goes further than only the Middle East and North Africa. The question of a political orientation, a leadership, that to some extent to have a protest movement is not enough. We have to give a political orientation. A particular leadership has to structure this movement and structure the demands to create a form, if you want, a form of dual power to challenge the centers of power. And this, again, is not a debate limited to the Middle East and North Africa. It's something that we are witnessing, I think, throughout the world.
Thanks for that, Joe. Sara, would you like to add? I mean, specifically in the case of Sudan, one of the most notable things has been the leadership of many different bodies, and you've written very persuasively about the various women's activists and women's groups in Sudan. But you also have, of course, very prominently the Sudanese Professionals Association and the role it has played in leading the Sudanese revolution. Can you talk about, from a Sudanese perspective, this question of leadership vis-a-vis the other struggles in the region?
Yeah, I think this has been, particularly in the first 6 months of the uprising, it gets a little bit more complicated from around June onwards, June 2019 onwards, when I'll speak about that. But this has been one of the strengths of the uprising in Sudan. We've had protests at several points in the last 30 years. We certainly had, since 2011, particularly since the independence of South Sudan or the secession of South Sudan, we saw protests or street protests very regularly. Some of those waves of protests were quite big, like in 2013, also in 2012, very much related to issues of, at that time, austerity and the economic situation. But the difference between then and what happened in 2018 is that there was a body or bodies that were able to really give those protests direction, able to organize, as you said, demands. I think it's a very dynamic process. So I'll give you an example. I mean, the SPA, or the Sudanese Professionals Association, which is a coalition of different trade unions and associations, from the doctors who have been quite militant actually in Sudan. They were striking quite regularrly in the years leading up to the revolution, to the teachers committee as well. I mean, these were all banned, right? Banned organizations under the regime. The main thing that the SPA had been working on in the years right prior to the uprising was the issue of the minimum wage, or the issue of raising the minimum wage. But these kinds of links that they were able to do between the different trade associations that positioned them in such a way that in December, when the protests were happening and spreading, they declared that they were also for the fall of the regime and joined, and then started the process of organizing with the political parties. I mean, what was interesting is for months, I remember at the beginning, particularly the first month when the SPA from December 25 became visible by leading the first big protest, December 25, 2018, in Khartoum. Many of us, we didn't know who these people were, other than 2 or 3 of them who were the spokespersons who had been arrested, and jailed very quickly. People were following an organization. The individuals themselves were not known and were protected, in fact, by the masses, because the regime very much wanted to get a hold of them. And that showed both 2 things. First of all, the effectiveness of their position and the way they were organizing. But also, of course, people trusted them more than the political parties. Political parties, including opposition parties, I think not just in Sudan, but across the region, especially youth, are quite wary of organized political parties. I mean, in Sudan, we see Sadiq al-Mahdi from the Ummah party, some of the faces that have been there since my parents were children, like leading the same parties. So for many people younger than myself, the SPA gave them something that they could believe in. And also that there was a brilliant move in January to come up with the Declaration of Freedom and Change, which is this program with points of these are the demands. Of course, it's building on the struggles over the years, but it was also a way of mobilizing the political parties, some of the armed movement, the civic groups, which also signed this declaration, and then gave more coherence to the protests, more demands. And this is something that made a huge difference from our past, not just from Egypt, but in the past, we made the regime fall, usually because the military took down their own leader and replaced him. This happened in 1964. Then there was a transition to elections, again in 1985. But 4 or 5 years later, we ended up in exactly the same place with the military coup. And so what was really fascinating in Sudan is in April, when al-Bashir was removed and his top lieutenants were removed, that's the slogan came out, the revolution has just begun. For me, this was different. I was a child in the Intifada. This was different. We had lost, and we wanted a change in the governance structure, not just in the regime. And so this organizing, particularly with the resistance committees, I think the SPA gets a lot of attention, but the kind of bedrock of the resistance in Sudan are these neighborhood small committees, mainly composed of youth, that are the ones that when the regime shut down the internet in June and dispersed the sit-in, the SPA had been so reliant on Facebook to mobilize. The resistance committees were able to step in and organize people locally, and on June 30th to turn out massive amounts of people. And so I would say it's not either leaderless in the case of Sudan or completely one leader, but it's the ability to organize, connect, and shift leadership as needed to meet that phase of the struggle that is most interesting, I think, in that case.
I think that's a really important point, that it's not a pure binary. It's not like having leadership the way the Sudanese struggle has in the form of the Sudanese Professionals Association. That doesn't exclude or preclude a more horizontal grassroots bottom-up structure, like in the form of these resistance committees. You actually have both. And what is the connection between them? How do the resistance committees relate or interface with the more traditional, not traditional leadership, but the more high visibility kind of, I don't want to say top down, but the Sudanese Professionals Association?
For example, during the sit-in last year, there were field committees of the Forces for Freedom of Change, of which the SPA is the biggest, the most prominent, but also other political parties. So the Forces for Freedom and Change had field committees that worked with the resistance committees to organize protests, to prepare people for protests, to mobilize, to deal with the medical issues, because we had a lot of violence. And so, the doctors would, the shifts in terms of who's taking care of things. Since the revolution, if anything, since the deal, if anything, there's been a proliferation of both resistance committees, but different civic bodies, whether it's with women's groups or what we call like al-Iqsam al-Matlabiyya, like the demand-based organizations. For example, in the areas where mining is wreaking havoc in people's lives, they are very much working closely with the resistance committees, which are then a pressure force for these areas at the level of the FFC, the civilian component. There are times where they come out against the FFC. So they're not kind of extension branches of the Forces for Freedom of Change. If anything, that's where the movement is, in the sense that they're very focused, for example, on the issue of justice, of transitional justice, and they've managed. It's not always convenient for the government for this issue to be front and center, but they haven't let that issue disappear. So they go out in protest to make demands on the government, but they also coordinate with the government. For example, with COVID, they're the ones that are doing a lot of the work on the ground in the absence of a health structure, really, that can deal with this crisis. So it's a very dynamic relationship that they have, but they cannot really, the FFG cannot really do anything if they try to, without the resistance committees being on board, without the neighborhood committees being on board, without a lot of the civic bodies being on board. The labor union, the union movement has also, the labor field has also been growing and expanding in this process of trying to rebuild the labor movements in Sudan. And so I think it's a very dynamic process, but I think without this horizontal grassroots structures, I think, the FFC is dominated by what we know traditionally, the elites, in a way, the professional elites. But these are the bodies that keep them accountable, I would say, to the revolutionary demands.
I think that's really fascinating and inspiring, frankly. So I want to turn to Syria now, and I would like to get your thoughts, Joe and Gilbert. It seems to me, correct me if you have a different reading, but it seems to me that we're in a somewhat paradoxical situation, in the sense that Assad has declared victory. Even regional states that were allied with the Syrian opposition, like Turkey, have moved on to other battles, for example, against the Kurds, the PYD. So the Syrian conflict is effectively over, militarily speaking, and yet we still see protests in different parts of the country. In Sweida, for example, which, for those who don't know, is a predominantly Druze province, supposedly religious and ethnic minorities like the Druze are supposed to be big supporters of the Assad regime, but here in the Druze stronghold of Sweida, there have been protests in the last few weeks with slogans. People are chanting slogans like "Syria belongs to us, not to the Assad family," and "Long live Syria, down with Bashar al-Assad." So there have also been protests in Daraa, where the Syrian uprising began in March 2011, and rural areas around Damascus. It almost feels reminiscent of that first phase of the Syrian struggle before its militarization. We're hearing similar slogans, and we're seeing very similar conditions. So here's my question. Is Syria, in a sense, back to square one, or is it somewhere else? Joe, rather than merely celebrating the eruption of these protests, as many people do, you recently wrote something sobering. You wrote, "These conditions do not automatically translate into political opportunities, particularly after more than 9 years of a destructive and murderous war, the absence of a structured, independent, democratic, and inclusive Syrian political opposition, which could appeal to the poorer classes, has made it difficult for various sectors of the population to unite and challenge the regime anew and on a national scale. Can you elaborate on that, Joe?
Yeah, of course. No, what is the thing is definitely after more than 9 years of war, the Syrian regime is nearly in control of 70% of the territory. Nearly 13 million Syrians, around to 20 million in the whole of Syria. You have one sector that is outside of the country of the Assad regime, which is in the hand of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the other parts are with Turkey, Turkish allied forces, and Tahrir al-Sham, so a jihadist coalition. Maybe I should remind people that the socio-economic situation is absolutely catastrophic in Syria. Before the COVID, level of poverty were above already 85%. Now it's most probably over. The Syrian pound has been losing continuously since October, but since the beginning of the uprising, its value. So high inflation. And as Syria has become a very important importer of products from outside, you can imagine that the prices have exploded. So even though the regime has been able to reach a form of, has been able to survive, and we should remind everyone this was mostly because, and primarily and mostly because of the foreign assistance given by Iran, Russia, and other political actors such as Hezbollah and other militias from Iraq, and that the Syrian regime has been trying to impose a form of hegemony in the areas that came back into its control. For example, some areas of Damascus province, you've spoken about Daraa, I will come back to it, and other areas, Aleppo, etc. This is, however, facing a lot of problems because the regime is lacking its means to reimpose, despite the use of various networks, a total form of hegemony, which creates a continuous instability. And actually, rising criticism has not been, limited to opposition people, but have been increasing among what we call, I don't think it's the right term, but we can use it today, loyalist communities, especially in the coast, but Damascus, Aleppo, etc. For example, we've seen even, forms of labor dissent in Tartus port that has now come under the management of the Russian company Stronggas, and we can come back maybe later to this, but Syria has deepened its neoliberal policies throughout the world, and it's not the only case that a state uses a crisis to deepen its neoliberal policies. So, and now the workers have lesser contract, and there have been different forms of labor dissent in this Tartus port of more than 3,600 workers, and also in another company also controlled that was privatized at the profit of the same Russian company, General Federalizer Company in Rif Homs in province of Homs. So you can see that there's also this sense, and this is important to say, that even the people living under the regime's authority are not, complete loyalists following the regime, and it is often portrayed. When it comes to Sweida and Daraa, I would a bit nuance what you said, Danny, about Sweida, because Sweida has witnessed demonstrations nearly since the first day of the uprising. Actually, Sweida was one of the first cities to come in solidarity with Daraa, having placards in solidarity with Daraa and elsewhere. And in Sweida, which is very interesting, stayed officially under the authority of the regime throughout the uprising or the war. But you had a situation where the central power was completely challenged by a form of third force that was around a big sort of militia called Rijal al-Karame, which is men of dignity, challenging the center of power, challenging the security services, meaning, for example, with the support of wide strata of the society and even some religious dignitaries that were generally close to the regime, forbidding, for example, the youth to be sent outside of the governorate to send in the Syrian army. So you had in Sweida Governorate more than 30,000 young men still in the governorate refusing to serve in the army. And you had a couple of demonstrations coming out, also very punctual, but some forms of protest throughout the years. So it's a bit more complicated, you see, Sweida. And what we witnessed in the past few weeks, now it's been a bit repressed. I don't know if you saw it being repressed by Ba'athist sector within Sweida, but it's always a situation of challenging the centers of power. For example, all the people that were arrested in the Sweida protest a few weeks ago were liberated by the militia I was mentioning. So they asked the liberation of these people. But what was interesting is that, challenging the Assad regime, challenging the allies of Assad regime, asking Iran and Russia to go out of Syria, and really this time with a clear demand around social justice issue. This was very much put forward, and there was an interesting mix of people between youth from the universities or youth, seeking for work, and a more older generation from leftist background, etc., organizing the protest. When it comes to Daraa, maybe people should know that Daraa just came back under the regime's control in 2018 in the so-called reconciliation agreement. And therefore, since the 2 past years, you still had former opposition groups maintaining their arms. And you had, a lot of killing of security forces from the regime by these groups, and not constant form of balance, but forms of clashes that occurred in Daraa in the past 2 years. And attempts of the regime to really control completely Daraa, etc. And so it's a mix, again, of people not being satisfied by the way the so-called reconciliation agreement was made, because public services did not come back, insecurity continued, arrests continued where they should not have been, and accompanied again with socio-economic demands. The last issue was also there was protest in Jaramana. Jaramana is very interesting because it's in Damascus province, very close to the capital, and linked historically to Sweida. But during the war, the city that was during the whole war, under the control of the regime, saw its population pass from around 200,000 people to nearly 1 million, because you had people from other sectors of Damascus province leaving areas that were bombed, and people that were historically linked to Sweida. And you had also protests over there. So you can see, and I will conclude in this, that yes, and unfortunately the thing is the protests are not linked to each other. There's no coordination between them. They might be solidarity in words with placards, particular placards. There's nothing to unify them. And today the opposition in exile is very much, what term should I use, discredited, to speak politely, and cannot reach wider sections of the population, while lacking any kind of power on the ground or reaches to the ground.
Gilbert, would you like to add anything to that picture that Joe has painted?
I think it's also important to clarify that when you say the regime is in control, the question is who is in control of the regime? Because the regime, what is the regime actually? What is the Syrian regime? This is a regime that is entirely dependent on two foreign powers. One is an international global power, which is Russia, and the second is a regional power, which is Iran. And they control whole sections of the country. They control the regime itself. And you will find in any, kind of comments on the Syrian situation by people who are very familiar with what's going on there, they will tell you this section of the security forces is Iranian and this other is Russian. We're speaking of sections of the same, the apparatuses, the security apparatuses of the Syrian regime. So it's a regime that is totally under control of foreign powers. And therefore, this is the big qualification that we should add when you say the regime is in control of this or that percentage of the territory. And basically, beyond that, this is a country where you have 5 occupation forces. And this is by also grouping all the forces that are connected to Iran into one, because otherwise you would have more than 5. But if you put all the forces connected to Iran into one under one chapter, then you have the oldest occupation, which is the Israeli one. Then you have the Iranian, you have the Russian, you have the US, and the Turkish, of course. The Turkish one is a very important factor there. So this is, I mean, definitely nothing that could be really described as a victory of the regime. It's a disastrous, absolutely disastrous situation. But I would also add a little point, which is what we are seeing now, and as Joe pointed to, are now protests related to the economic situation. This is now what is dominant. And the point is, what we are seeing in Syria here fits into the category of what we have seen in Iraq and we have seen in Lebanon, where the economic question unifies the people against those in power. You know, that's very important. And that's why even in areas that are supposed to be under regime control, you are seeing now people rising up. They wouldn't rise up in defense of those who are in Idlib. They wouldn't rise up because they support the opposition. Not at all. It's completely discredited. I mean, the opposition in exile, as Joe said. But they are rising up for their own interests. They are rising up for their bread, for their livelihood. They can't, you know, I mean, and that's what you have in Lebanon and Iraq also. You have a unification of the popular movement in all these countries against the power that be. It happens that Iran plays a major role in the 3 countries. But those movements are not against Iran alone. They are against Iran and the United States and the Saudi Kingdom and everybody. They are against everything. And one of their slogans is in Lebanon, you know, the famous slogan of all of them means all of them, kullun yani kullun in Arabic, which is very indicative of that. So it's putting the things horizontally, I mean, as a horizontal solidarity against those, I mean, from below against those at the top. And that also points to the one of the shortcomings of the Syrian uprising at the start, which was the failure of putting such demands, you know, and only focusing on the political demands. Had you had some kind of socially more radical kind of orientation of the uprising, things might have been different. And anyhow, the movement then would not have accepted as representatives an opposition in exile, which, if you compare it to, for instance, what the Sudanese popular movement accepted as a representative of it, is far, far, far to the right of that. It is it's completely right when compared to the kind of leadership that emerged as popular leadership in a country like Sudan. So that's why also that ever since the uprising mutated into a civil war in Syria, and with the intervention of the Gulf countries and the United States and everybody in trying to steer the opposition forces, the whole political, I mean, the whole, let's say, the whole framework of the political conflict shifted completely from a democratic one into one representing basically what I would call a clash between counter-revolutionary forces, because there were counter-revolutionary programs on both sides. And that's why, from the point of view of the interest of the Syrian people, whether the humanitarian or the political or the economic or any kind of interest, the best would have been, I mean, the sooner this whole war would have stopped, the better it is. The problem is that it's not completely over. And I wish it were even beyond that over, because then you would have more Daraa and more Sweida possible, because then people wouldn't see it any longer as a kind of, either sectarian threat or the threat of some ultra-fundamentalist forces or whatever. They would just look after their interests, their social, economic, their class interests. And that is the most important if you want to have a sustained revolutionary dynamics in any country.
This phrase, Gilbert, the clash of counter-revolutionary forces, is, I think, a very salient one, because it speaks to a kind of, there's a widespread sense amongst many activists, leftists around the world, that, it's very well understood that Saudi Arabia and more recently its partner in the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and other countries in the region, particularly the Gulf monarchies, represent a pillar of counter-revolution against progressive forces in the region, against the Arab uprisings, against popular mobilizations. Okay, that's well understood. The role of Saudi Arabia and its allies in the Gulf as counter-revolutionary forces is very well understood. There's a huge literature on it, and it's an uncontroversial point. What's a little bit murkier, however, is the counter-revolutionary role of the other side of the equation. So the counter-revolutionary role that Iran and Hezbollah play, particularly in the Syrian conflict, but more recently in Iraq and in Lebanon. So, in the minds of many activists, leftists, anti-imperialists in the West, because Saudi Arabia is clearly understood as a counter-revolutionary force, and because Iran is Saudi Arabia's competitor, because Iran and Saudi Arabia have a regional rivalry or a Cold War in the region, it's somehow believed that Iran represents an axis of resistance along with its allies in Hezbollah and so on. And so I want to put to both Joseph and Gilbert, who have done some of the most important writing on this. I mean, Joe, you've written an entire book debunking the myth that Hezbollah is some sort of resistance force. It presents a critique of what you call the political economy of Lebanon's Party of God. Can the two of you address this mythology that somehow what you have in the region is a battle between the counter-revolutionary forces of Saudi Arabia on the one hand and its allies, and then on the other hand, this axis of resistance in the form of Syria, Iran, and Hezbollah on the other? Can you talk about what's wrong with that perception? Let's start with Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Yeah, I can add one more axis of counter-revolution if you want. It's Turkey and Qatar that have played also a very much counter-revolutionary role and still playing as such throughout the region. And if you want to see what's happening in Syria, the particular role of Turkey regarding the assistance it has given to reactionary militias, which has led, for example, to the occupation of Afrin, with demographic change, with forced displacement of 300,000 people. And more generally, Turkey and Qatar have supported, the Muslim Brotherhood and other forms of Islamic fundamentalist forces, which we've mentioned have played a very much counter-revolutionary role in the region throughout different countries and since 2011. So we could add different counter-revolutionary axis, but I thought it was important. Comes to Iran and Hezbollah, what I think is very important is that, to some extent, unfortunately, even among anti-war movement, anti-imperialism has been very much limited to opposition to the US. So a very much misunderstanding, I would say, of imperialism and how you have various rival capitalist states struggling against each other, but also collaborating with each other. And we should always remind people that, for example, in Iraq, Iran and the US have been collaborated when it comes since the first elected governments. The prime minister, the main were collaborating for most part.
That's a good point. And in Syria, of course, the United States and Russia have collaborated on many, many more things than they have opposed one another.
Indeed. And you had Afghanistan before with Iran and the US, 2001. But as I said, I think it's a problem that is rooted, only seeing kind of the only imperialist actor being the US. But more importantly, you never analyze or judge a state according solely to its foreign policy, but you should judge a state according to its policies regarding its popular classes, socio-economic issues, etc. And this, I think, as internationalist socialists, is the first thing we should do. If we fail to do this, we can reach, for example, typically the kind of discourse that see Hezbollah and Iran as resistant actor, even anti-imperialist, while they're suggesting another authoritarian project that is different from, obviously, the authoritarian project supported by the US through various proxies, etc. And we should oppose both. We shouldn't choose between them. And also, whether Hezbollah and Lebanon, Netanyahu has become the main actor since the October's uprising, opposing the protest movement. And Hassan Nasrallah's first speech during the uprising in October in Lebanon was very much aggressive, accusing the protesters of being, funded by foreign embassies, to which most of the protesters would react saying, you're funded by hundreds of millions of dollars by Iran, so how can you accuse us of being funded by foreign embassies? But more generally, Hezbollah's role in Syria or in Lebanon has been counter-revolutionary. And Hezbollah is today one of the key actors of the ruling class in Lebanon, and is today actually more and more calling back the former Prime Minister Saad Hariri to come back in place, and has not opposed various neoliberal policies and governments, etc. So we could go on. And in Iran also you have similar kind of political orientation when it comes to liberalization of the economy, of repression towards labor movement, labor unions. So again, it's not about choosing this kind of various axes of country, I would say, but again, always having our base of support in protest movement, asking for demanding democracy and social justice.
So would you agree that although Iran and Saudi Arabia are at odds with one another and are engaged in a war of position in terms of the geopolitics of the region, despite this this battle between Iran and Saudi Arabia, they both have counter-revolutionary agendas, and there's a sense in which they are dual counter-revolutionary forces in the region?
Indeed. Yes, definitely.
Gilbert, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, it's a vast topic, so yes, we can add. Starting by adding that before the regional configuration, you have also the global one, and the same people who believe that Iran is a anti-imperialist progressive force usually believe that Russia is. Again, something like that. And some of them, I mean, we have that, for instance, into parts of the communist of the remnants of the communist movement in the Arab countries who still believe that Russia is the Soviet Union. And Putin, that sounds, like Lenin and Stalin, so that should be fine. and when you think of that, I mean, Russia is by any standard an imperialist country, like the United States. It's an imperialist country, except that it's from the point of view of the social and political system, it's much worse than the United States because it's a completely authoritarian regime. Trump would love to be in the position of Putin. That's why he admires Putin so much. He's a great admirer of Vladimir Putin because Vladimir Putin has what Trump doesn't have. That is this ability of doing whatever he wants, controlling the country completely. And add to that the social economic system, the kind of neoliberal, if you want, regime that you have in Russia is far worse than anything you have in any Western country. And yet, and when you see how Russia treats the Chechen people, for instance, how it did it, how it intervenes here and there, I mean, and the kind of monopolies that you have now in Russia, like the gas and oil and gas monopolies. So this is, in the full sense of the term, an imperialist, a capitalist, and a vicious capitalist country, and therefore to believe that this, I mean, you should support Russia, or Russia is on the side of anti-imperialists, is just, is just falling into what precisely, because these, I mean, the same people would refer to, for instance, Lenin. Well, the Bolsheviks in the First World War, their kind of attitude was precisely rejecting the siding with any imperialism and opposing all of them at the same time. So this kind of internationalism seems to have been very much weakened nowadays. And then secondly, if you shift to the regional level, yes, of course, the Saudi, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt axis is an axis of evil, if you want to use the Bush kind of term. Sara could tell you a lot about their intervention in Sudan. They are the key foreign reactionary counter-revolutionary force in Sudan. They are backing the worst people in Sudan, including those militias, which are actually major part now of the regime and the military forces. But the same, for instance, can converge with Russia, and as is the case in Libya, where Russia and Egypt and the United Arab Emirates are intervening militarily on the same side in backing the same Haftar kind of, I mean, the Haftar forces in Libya. And finally, yes, I mean, just imagine this, Danny, a party that is called the Party of God, right?
Hezbollah.
And yeah, and that regards as its main model and completely supports and is very narrowly linked to the only theocratic state in the world, if you accept the Vatican. The Vatican is a mini-state where the Pope is elected by his peers. Well, in Iran, which is a real state, the supreme guide is elected by his peers, and that's the supreme authority in the country, right? And so this is the only real theocracy in today's world. It's a viciously neoliberal kind of regime. So from whichever angle you take it, to believe that this is something that is on the left is just, mind-boggling. I mean, how can anyone who is really on the left see in that something? Now, the fact that they clash with Israel and the United States is one thing. The fact that they are progressive is a completely different thing. The classical historical example was when fascist Italy attacked Ethiopia. Okay, so I mean, as an anti-imperialist, you would stand with the Ethiopian people, with even the Ethiopian state, against the fascist Italian invasion. But doesn't mean that you support Haile Selassie, one of the most reactionary, slave-owning kind of regimes that you had at the time. So the point is here. You can stand with. I mean, I have absolutely no problem standing with Hezbollah against an Israeli intervention in Lebanon. I have no problem standing with Iran against U.S. aggression. This is normal. But at the same time, I have absolutely no illusion about what these forces represent on the social and political level, and the fact that from the class point of view, if you want, they are part of the enemy. They are not part of the revolutionary camp. And that was seen very clearly in the recent uprising in Lebanon, the same for the Iran-linked forces in Iraq, where these forces indeed came out very strongly against the protest movement and even tried to physically repress it. It's not only speeches, it's physical attempts at physical repression with people killed in Iraq. A lot of people killed in Iraq, not in Lebanon, but in Lebanon you had physical violence. So we have to keep that in mind. And again, what does it mean to be a revolutionary and all that if such basic things you can't see? Why are you on the left? Are you on the left just because you are against Washington and therefore you support anything that is against Washington, or are you against Washington because you are for democracy, social justice, etc.? If the second, then you have to be against all enemies of democracy and social justice, not only Washington. Washington being a major one of them, but not the only one.
And just to underscore your point about Russia, Gilbert, and its allegiances, Vanessa Ghezari of The Intercept has noted that the Mueller report highlights, this is quote, highlights Russia's relationship with the UAE and with these Gulf states, which has been long-standing and has involved a lot of economic and business exchange, as well as a sort of common idea about the importance of autocratic rulers in the world and how they should be supported, and questioning any kind of dissident movements that come up against them. So I mean, she says, I think these countries have really made common cause with each other. And so when you see that, like in the case of the Seychelles meeting, it's a clear line from Russia to the UAE to the Trump administration.
Yeah, they have in common. Sorry.
No, just Danny, Sarah wanted to jump in before on the...
Please, okay. Sara.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Iran because when we mentioned the uprisings or this wave of uprisings in the Arab world, of course, we're speaking about the Arab world, but we've been talking about the Iranian regime, but not so much the fact that around the same time of the uprising in Iraq, there was also a mass uprising in Iran. I think this is very, very important because we tend to talk about Iran often as the regime. I mean, it's a powerful regime. It obviously has its hands in many different places. But first of all, the economic situation, this is something that across the Arab region, which of course, I have a friend who has also pointed out that we keep saying Arab Spring, but of course, it's not just Arabs in this region. I mean, there's a lot of other groups that have also been part of these uprisings. But Iran as well, the economic situation is terrible. The repression has been terrible. I remember when the uprising happened there, I think within a few days, about 800 people have been killed by the regime. There are still people that are on death row for participating in these protests. But there is much, much obviously more in common between many of the Iranian masses and these other countries where the Iranian regime is intervening and actually both economically and politically playing a role in exploiting them, as in Syria, than they have with the regimes themselves. So this is incredibly important, I think, and it's something that we really should talk about. I often think, in the Sudanese case as well, if I focus my gaze at the level of what the formal political structures are doing, it looks much worse than if I look at these movements and what they're saying and what they're asking. And I think this is incredibly important. In the case of Sudan, I mean, Iran, it's very far from us, but of course it has also in the early years of our regime, it was a source of inspiration for the Inqaz regime, as we call it in Sudan, al-Bashir and Hassan al-Turabi at the time. They also gave material support. But there's many parallels also at the level of movements and the kind of diversity in the country. But I think also if we look to Ethiopia, also in recent years, this is a neighboring country of ours, in recent weeks, there's been also very big protests. And a lot of them, again, we have this issue of the form of neoliberal governance, the kinds of people I think there's something very much going on where there's a palpable sense of people are fed up with the economic inequality, with the inability to sustain their lives, with the lack of action, and with the neoliberal policies. So even our own government, right? We keep saying this is the popular forces. Yes, definitely they're better. The civilian components of this government are much better than many in the other region, but the government is still having a neoliberal bent. And so also one of the questions I have, and I want to ask about these revolutionary movements, is there is also the issue of things that we share, for example, debt, the mass debt burden that we are dealing with, which means that groups like the IMF and the Western countries as well. I mean, in our case, and I think this is the case also in Turkey, in Egypt, in Libya, the European Union is in many ways, you could also say, a counter-revolutionary force, in the sense that through the development agendas and so forth, there is cooperation on this issue of externalized borders, which means that in our case, for example, the Janjaweed RSF militia could never have been that powerful without the kind of concrete support to this border policies that the EU has done and collaborated with the al-Bashir regime to carry out in the region. This is in Libya, in Egypt, in Turkey, in many different places. And I think this is also something that many of these countries share. So that's just something that I wanted to mention as well. It's not just Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the UAE. In Sudan's case, for example, the EU's main interest in that region is the issue of migration, to try to control migration, to prevent migrants from reaching the Mediterranean. And for the US, the war on terror. I mean, from Somalia onto that whole region, there's a lot of interest also in that agenda.
Thanks for bringing in that global perspective. Those are really important points, Sara. Either Joe or Gilbert, would either of you like to comment on that? I just want to note also that we have a few questions from the audience for all three of you, and we want to have time for them. But before we move to audience questions, would either of you like to respond to Sara's point?
I'm fine.
No, I totally agree. And I think actually you have a lot of European Union countries that really want to go back to the situation pre-2011 with a new Gaddafi. And it's important, we were talking about so-called anti-imperialist, how Gaddafi was presented as an anti-imperialist while he was the main, if you want, gatekeeper, so-called, and paid by the European Union to keep migrants from coming to Europe. And I think this is important to say, and I totally agree with Sarah. The contract of shame that is until now between European Union and Turkey is using this as a bargaining chip as well, and the refugees are being used as a bargaining chip in a odious way. So no, I totally agree with this.
Really important. All right, we have several questions. Miriam Asfar wants to know, what do speakers think about Morocco? The Rif is a leading flame and highlights two things, in my opinion. The place of Africa, Sudan and Morocco are core cases of second wave analysis. The importance of regional prism. State as a prism is not informative to understand dynamics in Morocco, seeing the weight of the Rif region. At the same time, Rif can't be understood without Mahzan state. Would anyone like to comment on that? Any of the three of you?
I can comment if you want, but Morocco has been part of the first wave in a less spectacular form than the uprisings that you had in 6 countries in the region, but it witnessed an important social movement for many months, and then this could be diffused by the monarchy through some political moves and through co-opting one of the Islamic forces in the country. But then the same issue applies to Morocco as to the rest. That is, the socio-economic deep roots of the uprisings were there, and it kept simmering, and every now and then boiling here and there. You had various regional instances of struggle, and of course up to the reef, the reef struggle, which was very important. Unfortunately, that's another case of defeat, because we have had and will still have many defeats in the years to come. The key point are not the defeats. The key point is that you have movements, and they are defeated, okay, but they will. I mean, they will come to the fore again. Presently, the situation in Morocco is quite reactionary. The regime has also seized the opportunity of COVID and other issues. There is a crackdown on political freedoms, on political expression, on any forms of criticisms of the regime. It will. I mean, what we have seen in other countries where you had much more repressive regimes means that sooner or later this is a country where you will have which will reach the boiling point and go into a major uprising mode. It hasn't been the case yet, but sooner or later this will happen. Like Sudan, this is a country that had not at the same level that you had in Sudan in '64 and '85, but in the early '80s you had a major uprising in Casablanca. It was a social uprising, and the country will see something like this for sure in the coming period, where the social economic conditions are aggravated by the global now huge economic crisis.
If I may, Danny, add 2 points. No, what I think is interesting with the Reef, and I will make a comparison with Syria, is that the Reef is two important things to say. Is that it is a particular area of a majority identity Berber, so a minority that has been to some extent, discriminated in Morocco with socio-economic deprivation.
It's not a minority; it's a vast majority. In
okay, it's a vast majority. I'm sorry, but it has been. There's a kind of Arab domination, let's say. Let's put it this way. But you're right. It's demographically speaking, it's a majority. But it's always a test in the beginning of the uprisings that when it's in a periphery with a particular identity, to join it with the more general uprising. And often what was the answer in Morocco, for example, against the Reef was saying, basically, they're separatists. This is a separatist uprising trying to divide the movement. And this is something we've seen also in Syria regarding, when it comes to Kurdish interests, Kurdish political and socio-economic interests. For example, the Northeast, which is just in agriculture, oil, etc., was the most impoverished area of Syria, and still is to many extent, and majority inhabited by Kurdish population. And as soon there were particular Kurdish demands, they were accused of being separatist. And until now, the main, and this is where the main opposition actors and the regime agrees, is that to call the Kurds separatists for the vast majority. And I think while the uprising were opening the ability to exchange between various populations or communities of Syria, as soon as with the militarization and the counter-revolutionary forces, this opening was closed. But I think this is something also very important, that this uprising also opened to some extent in particular countries the possibility to tackle about minority issues that is linked very often with socio-economic issues.
That's an important point. And let me just plug, there's a chapter in Joe's book, Syria After the Uprisings, devoted to the Kurdish question in Syria, a very good one. And there was a webinar just a few days ago in this series on Kurdish self-determination, Kurdish struggles in Syria and regionally. And that is, the video of that webinar is available at SyrianRevolt.org. Sara, did you want to add anything to this question?
I think it's very interesting that Miriam mentioned the Reef movements in Morocco, because precisely because it's a country that's also linked to the first wave of uprisings. I mean, as Gilbert mentioned, somehow the monarchy there managed to try to take the steam out of the movement there through constitutional reform and other ways. But sort of following the reef mobilizations and protests and movements in the last few years, it's very inspiring. And I think we also have to move away from I think, you know, what is a revolution, what isn't, what is a successful uprising, what is a failure, and really try to look at these dynamics of social movement change in different contexts with different configurations. And I think Morocco is an incredibly interesting case of that that should be followed and supported very closely. Jordan is another one of those, of course, that also has had some really interesting mobilizations and protests, and is also has lessons to give the rest of us as well. So, I mean, I don't want to add anything specific, but I think that it's a really good thing that she brought up also Morocco in this context.
Excellent. We have another question from Professor Moja Khaf, widely published poet.
Yeah, but may I say one thing just before Danny, because on the same topic. I think, I mean, I understand what Joe was trying to do, but we shouldn't put or believe that the Reef movement is like the Kurdish movement in Syria. That's why I said they are not. I mean, the Amazigh are not a minority in Morocco. They are the majority of the population, and the movement in the Reef did not start on any kind of national or ethnic issue or whatever. It started on a social issue, very much like the Tunisian uprising in December 2010, with a tragic case, a tragic incident, which was very much revealing the social economic oppression that you have in the country. So I just wanted to, because someone listening to us might believe that these are similar kind of regional autonomist or national movement, as the case of the Kurds, actually.
Joe, did you want to respond to that?
No, I agree. I think it's interesting just to put forward that there are particular identity issues that we bring forward, but that's, I'm not in contradiction, just wanted to make parallel, but I totally agree with Gilbert said.
Okay, we have a question from Moja Khaf, poet and activist. She says, I would suggest that perhaps the Syrian revolution in 2011 had an emerging female leadership that was pushed aside by counter-revolutionary forces. Would anyone care to comment? I specifically have in mind two women from early 2011 who had brought together large numbers of local coordinating committees into two of the four earliest coalitions of LCCs. Joe, would you like to take that one?
Yes, definitely. In the leadership of the LCC, you had half women. Half of the leadership, were women, and including Hazan Zaytoune, and one of the other kind of coordination committees. You had Soher Atasi. So you had different, definitely, women playing a key role within, different committee coordination committees and local coordination committees and others. This is for certain, and it's not to what I mentioned in the beginning of the need of a strong women movement. It does to deny that in Syria we haven't witnessed strong participation of women from below especially in the two first years of the uprising in various areas of Syria. This was the case, but it wasn't an independent mass women movement because of the various difficulties that were facing Syria, and increasingly, obviously, the militarization and the rise of various Islamic fundamentalist forces and extremist forces, but also within opposition representation actors in exile, such as the Syrian National Council or the Itilaf, pushing out women's representation, or even undermining women's rights, etc. So it's not only actors on the ground, but it was also the political opposition in exile that completely put aside, because of their collaboration, notably with the Muslim Brotherhood, but all the conservative actors completely put aside women's representation and women's rights.
Sara, would you like to add anything to that or respond to Moja Khaf's question?
I think this is a dynamic that you see across many of these uprisings. The pushing aside of women who are often critical to the uprisings themselves, but when it comes to these periods of what do you do with power after, we're experiencing this in Sudan right now as we speak. There's been definitely an attempt to marginalize women, even though if you look at not just, I mean, of course, this has gotten a lot of attention. The sheer number and the visibility of women in the struggle in Sudan was very clear. But also, women's groups were politically positioned as well. I mean, they're two of the less than 26 signatories of the Declaration for Freedom of Change are two big coalitions, the No to the Oppression of Women coalition and Mensam, which is also a coalition of women activists. You have the Sudanese Women's Union, which is a very, it's been repressed by different dictatorships, but it has a very old history. And you have a proliferation of organizing by women also since. And yet we see, for example, the peace process being carried out at the moment towards it's supposed to be towards its conclusions. And it's a very old style politics. It's not revolutionary politics where, you make a space for women with no intersectional lens whatsoever to give women's opinions. صوت المرأة, it's an article, woman's voice, as if it's one. There is a problem of representation in transitional structures of governance. This is something that women's activists particularly have focused on. But of course, women in, for example, the Nertiti sit-in right now and other areas have highlighted issues of sexual violence that they've been facing for, at least in Darfur since 2003, since the conflict began, where you have, rape as a systematic practice in the war. And it's a battle, and that kind of leads me to one very important lesson, which is you can have a lot of women's participation and so forth. I think one of my comrades said, it's when women are not there that we should be noting it, not when they are there. That's an important point. But for me, it's really about the importance of a parallel, strong feminist movement, because you cannot assume that the general movement is going to position the interests of women in an intersectional way in these processes. And in fact, it's another struggle within the struggle. And so this is the case in Syria, it was the case in Egypt, it's the case in many of these. And we really need to network also on this and learn lessons also across borders on this issue as well.
Indeed. We have a question from Argentina, from Professor Jodor Jalit at the 3rd of February State University in Buenos Aires. Thank you to the organizers, the moderator, and panelists. I would like to ask about the role of the diaspora in the uprising. Lebanese and Syrian diaspora institutions in Argentina continued to deny the socio-economic demands raised by the uprisings. Even when the gravity of the situation is recognized, the Lebanese rhetoric may take on a sectarian tone, while Syrians tend to blame external pressure. Can you comment on the role, if any, of diaspora for the uprisings, be it in Lebanon, Syria, or Sudan? And that's, I'm glad that we have this question, because Sara, I was going to ask you about that earlier in the discussion, because you are involved, for example, in an organization that I believe is called Sudan Uprising Germany. And I've been in touch with a number of Sudanese activists and intellectuals all over, in Canada, the UK, the US, and it seems to me that in the Sudanese case, that this network, this transnational network of solidarity activists and people connected to the Sudanese Professionals Association has played a quite critical role in the movement.
Yeah, the diaspora has been very much an actor, I think, in the Sudanese revolution. I mean, it mobilized also very early. I mean, it also goes back to the prior to the revolution. I mean, we've had successive waves of migration and displacement starting from the early 90s after the al-Bashir coup, where people were mass fired from public institutions and replaced. Some of those have left, but of course, the main migration has been because of the war, the conflict issues, and the economic collapse as well. And the diaspora, so a lot of the Sudanese diaspora is already quite politicized, and that helped. But what also helped was organizing. Again, I mean, you have organizations like both, for example, some of the Darfurian armed movements who have extensions in the outside through these populations that are in France and elsewhere. But you also have the SPA has branches in different places. You have an extension of organizing between the inside and the outside. And I would say this has also been critical, particularly during the height of the protests, not just because the diaspora, especially in the first month when there was no media visibility in the international media or the Arab media, actually it wasn't being taken very seriously what was happening in Sudan. I mean, it was the diaspora that was pushing to get information out, but to also get resources into the country, particularly to treat the injured, for example, and so forth. I think the diaspora's role at the moment is more complicated in some ways, in the sense that, for example, if I think of the US, where my family went into exile in the early 90s, that's the diaspora that I'm most from, even though I live in Germany. There is also some of the neoliberal ideas coming into the idea of technocracy and what is it that this professional new government that is not corrupt going to do? They're also coming through us as well. But I think, groups like the one I'm involved in here, it's been very important to also support the revolution from the outside. I mean, us having spoken about how important it is to counter the counter-revolution, which is coming from different parts of the world. We also have a role to play in those countries and to kind of keep that momentum going. And so this is, for example, what we try to do here by really trying to both support the more revolutionary parts of the movement there, but also to challenge some of the discourse about the neutrality of the European Union in the Sudanese case and so forth.
Gilbert, as someone who was born in the Lebanese diaspora in Senegal, would you like to comment on this question from Argentina?
I think the importance of the diaspora's role is proportional to the degree of freedoms that you have in the country. And that's why the role of diasporas have been much bigger in the case of countries like Sudan and Syria than in the case of Lebanon. Lebanon, you have a very large diaspora, but to say that it played a key role in the uprising would be exaggerated. I mean, it tried to link up because, you have generations of diaspora, but those with ongoing links with the country try to link up with, or part of the people try to link up with the movement. You had the same splits among the people outside that than you had inside, but that's very limited when you compare with Syria and Sudan. And Syria and Sudan we can contrast them also in the role of the diaspora, in the sense that, as Sara explained, the Sudanese diaspora was very helpful for the movement inside the country. It was at the service, if you want, of the movement inside the country. At some point, for instance, when the regime tried to suppress the internet and the communications tools of the movement within Sudan, knowing that, for instance, for the SPA, the internet was a very important tool in its political organization. Well, the diaspora stepped in and helped in that regard. Whereas in Syria, what happened is that the political opposition in exile ended up, how to say, proclaiming itself as the representative of the uprising, and that was connected to the weakness of organization inside the country. Big difference with Sudan. And that role proved fatal, actually, to the Syrian revolution. So here we have a major difference. I think diasporas can play a very useful role, but provided the movement inside the country is organized as it should be in facing a revolutionary process. That's a very, very important difference here. I think that Sara wants to say something.
I just wanted to say I completely agree with Gilbert. I think there are, there have been attempts from people on the outside in the past to, you have a Twitter account and you have a lot of followers and you want to mobilize a revolution inside Sudan. It doesn't work like that. I mean, if there isn't the structures and their extensions and that relationship and a framework, I personally don't think in the case of Sudan, any groups based on the outside could have led the revolution. The reason it worked is because it was a supportive role. It was supporting the organizing inside the country and being an extension of it. I also wanted to say in the Lebanese case, I mean, it's a very small part of their movement there, but I find it incredibly hopeful that there have been attempts by some groups there to try to really network and organize amongst workers, also the Sudanese who are, living there and working some very difficult and menial jobs in Lebanon, who are an important part of the working class, but also Ethiopian domestic worker, the kafala system in Lebanon. It's a small part of it, but I think it's incredibly important and interesting, and we haven't seen something like that in Sudan, for example, or elsewhere, where you try to organize along class lines. And this is another view of a diaspora, right? And about these revolutions and the learning that I don't think we pay a lot of attention to, and that is really important and critical. So I'm interested in that in Lebanon, actually. What is these types of attempts to do this sort of not to organize along national lines or nationalistic lines, but along class lines, and try to network workers, Lebanese and non-Lebanese, including the Sudanese and the Ethiopians.
Well, on that note, it is time to bring things to a close, but I like the idea that, this theme of social movement learning, revolutionary learning has come up several times in this discussion. I'd like to think that this panel today has itself perhaps played a small role in a kind of cross-cutting social movement learning and can contribute to further discussion down the road. I want to thank you tremendously to each of our panelists. This has been a fabulously rich and thought-provoking conversation. I want to extend my gratitude to each of you for sharing your critical perspectives. And before we close, I want to remind people that if you're in a position to make a donation, no matter how small, please consider giving to Haymarket Books. And please register for Haymarket's upcoming events. Wednesday, July 29th, Racism is a Public Health Crisis. Thursday, July 30th, The Tragedy of American Science with Cliff Connor and Sarah Lazar. Also, there remain 2 more webinars in this series on Syria. This coming Wednesday, July 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Jailed Revolutionaries, Resistance to Assad's Carceral State. And the final webinar on Wednesday, August 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Where Next for the Syrian Struggle. You can go to SyrianRevolt.org for more details on those final 2 webinars, SyrianRevolt.org. I want to thank you again to Maggie for live captioning this event. Thanks to Haymarket Books and Pluto Press for co-sponsoring this live stream. Thanks to all of you who joined us today, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you to John. Thank you.